Good morning, fellow ruminators. Welcome back to another session, Rumination with Andrew. Thank you so much for joining, and it is indeed my pleasure to be with you one more time to discuss an important topical matter. Now, this morning, we are going to be talking about the commercialization of Black History Month. So every February, particularly in America, since the founding of Black History Month, and that month was founded by Carter G. Woodson, who wrote about the miseducation of the Negro. And by Negro, those of you who do not understand, the word Negro is derived from the Portuguese word for Black, right? Because in America, people tend to identify themselves particularly as Black and white and, Asian and Latino, and now you have what they call mixed race, whatever that means, right? Because there was a geneticist in the United States, a British geneticist, who suggested that over 90% of people who deem themselves to be white in the South, that's in the US South, can have Black genes, right? So over 90% of the people in America, right, particularly in the South, have Black blood. They have Black genes, right? So this one drop, principle or philosophy is nonsense, right? And suggesting that you are pure white and you're pure Black, um, having had many years, centuries of slavery in your country is nonsense. And with the wide-scale raping and abuse, sexual abuse of European people to Black people, and afterwards you have your interracial mingling and mixing and marriage, right? I do not think that anybody in the United States can deem themselves to be fully pure. Perhaps very recent immigrants can, I don't know. But for those who have been in the United States perhaps since the 1990s and onward, not 1990s, but the 19th century, I beg your pardon, from the 19th century and onwards, you cannot be fully white or fully Black. It's nonsense, right? But that is the history that you have been told to accept. That is the narrative that has been given to you. And many of us need to educate ourselves about what this concept of race is all about. Now, remember I told you also in the 16th century, that was the time that thereabout, that the whole concept of this white race came about. The elites, right? That's the elite Europeans at the time, the slave masters, they were not desirous of populations of people uniting together against the system, all right, which was controlled by the minority, right? The minority rich. Because they were against that and they were fearful of such an occurrence, they decided to make people, to categorize people, right, into different groups, into white, what we call white. They say that they were whites. Before, people described themselves, even in Europe, as belonging to the Italian race, the Irish race, the British race, the German race. Nobody talked about before the 16th century being white and Black. So we have to understand that that is a subjective terminology. It's not scientific in any stretch of the imagination. But people have deemed themselves, and they still call themselves Black and white. Who is Black? And in America particularly, being Black means that you behave a certain way and you have a certain custom and there's certain norms. And particularly in the Democratic Party, they think that you should be uneducated and they're going to be nice to you and provide a job for you, even though you're not as qualified as the so-called white person. And that is why we're seeing all of what is happening in the media about Claudine Gay, because apparently, even though she went to Harvard, she didn't have the scholastic aptitude equivalent to that of her white counterpart, right? She's just somebody who went there because, of the diversity, equity, and inclusion program. Now, that is the purpose of that program, my friends, okay? The Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Program desires to put Black people so-called Black people, that is, and other minorities in a box, and to suggest that we have to be paternalistic to them and we have to be sorry for them because they do not have the scholastic aptitude to do and to achieve excellence as white people, so-called white people, are able to do, which is a farce, right? But many people believe that, and including Black people, and they laud the efforts of these so-called white people to be inclusive. But do you think that these white people are desirous of achieving the goals of that inclusion, diversity, equity, and inclusion policy? No, they're not, right? What they're trying to do is to divide and to conquer. And that's exactly what they did when they came up with this race concept to divide the human population. Because for those of you who do not know, if you hail from a country, if you were born in a country, that is your culture. And the culture is what orientates you and shapes your worldview, shapes your understanding of the world, right? As far as I am concerned, when you think of a so-called white Russian, and I think I've said it on this channel before, and a white American, a so-called Black American is more in touch with the thinking and the worldview of a so-called white American because both of them came from the same soil. They were born in the same culture and they were acculturated to behaving practically the same way. And people outside of the United States see all Americans as Americans. You know, they're not attaching, they might say Black American because on the exterior, and we have been socialized that way, the person looks Black. Remember now we said on this channel, and that is supported by geneticists and other scientists, that there are no races and nobody is Black or white, right? What we are different shades of brown, right? And we have from dark brown to the lighter complexion. And there are books on that. And we need to educate ourselves about these things and to educate our children about this whole misnomer of race, that it is not a right word, that it does not exist as human beings think it exists, right? We are separated by nations and languages and cultures. Nations, languages, and cultures. That is what make the difference, right? It's not about the color of your skin. Has nothing to do with how you behave, what academic excellence you can achieve, right? Or what the human characteristics that you might, you know, you might diffuse. Now, there are individuals who will say, oh, Black people don't listen, or Black people talk too much. And I'm saying that's a personality trait, and I've seen a lot of so-called white people who chat a lot, right, who do not listen, and all of the other discriminatory characteristics and attributes that they'd like to say are, you know, are what Black people portray a lot of times, right? Now, the thing about it is that we too have scholastic aptitude. And, they tend to look, for example, yesterday I was thinking about Frederick Douglass. And, a lot of times when Americans talk about the people who have mastered standard English, and they will look at a person like Abraham Lincoln, right? The great emancipator, as many historians have him down as one of the finest in terms of the use of standard American English. But when you look at Frederick Douglass's writings, I have not heard him. Of course, we have not yet heard Abraham Lincoln either. But when you look at how Frederick Douglass strung his words together, what a man he was, and the command of English, I think his English was superior, even though he was a former slave, to that of Abraham Lincoln. I think so. And if people look carefully at what he had to say, and I think that he is underused in America's history, because again, because of this Black and white divide, that Americans cannot see beyond the color of one's skin. It's time for Americans to understand that the US is divided into also two groups, the elites and those who are not a part of the elites. Well, yes, if you are not an elite, you can also join club with them, as going to their institutions and then joining their clubs, their different sororities and fraternities and whatever political systems that you want to join, and then you perhaps will be a baptized member of that particular class. Other than that, they're still in the minorities, or in the minority, and they are in opposition against you, right? So when we talk about there's a war and the common American man is thinking that his interest is being defended, your interest is not being defended. And I want also to talk about the fact, or to highlight the fact, that if you look at what is happening right now as to America as an empire, it's a world empire now. Back then during slavery, it was a domestic empire. It was a continental empire, I should say, not domestic, but it was a continental empire for the most part of slavery, right? That's US slavery. And the slavery as a system was not defending the interests of the common American. If you look what happened in the South particularly, many of the white people who lived in the South were dirt poor, and they were just one rank below slavery, right? They were not particularly sophisticated by any sort of imagination. They were not educated, and they were also not very ambitious. Do you know what the US white Southerners desired and what they aspired for? All they wanted was to have a piece of land and a slave, right? That is how they thought that they could be able to, to eke out a standard of living, right? They were not desirous of educating themselves. They thought that that was for the elites, the elite whites living in the South, who would send their children to England, because during slavery, the US Southerners, the US white Southerners did not really think themselves to be Americans. They weren't proud to be Americans. Remember now that you're talking about just a few, well, I shouldn't say a few, but some years short of American independence, right? Which took place in 1776. And if we talk about the fact that the Constitution and the US Constitution was written and ratified around about 1787, right? I think was ratified in the US Constitution was ratified in 1789. Then you had the Bill of Rights, right? That was ratified in 1791, right? So when you think about that, you think that 1791 to when did the Civil War happen? But slavery, the height of slavery started, American history started around about 1820. So, and lasted until the Civil War. So when you think about that, you realize that there was a short period of time there between 1791 and say 1860. So many of the Southern whites would send their children to England to be educated, because that is where they thought, the quality education came from. And they were not interested in building universities and building schools in the South, right, to educate their natives. So the elites would send their children to England to study, so that they could also pick up the norms and be socialized into the norms and customs and philosophies of the British, because they still consider themselves to be British, the upper elite, the upper echelon of society. And to some extent, there is some leftover of that sort of thinking, where you still find US elites sending their children to Britain, right, to be educated and to be immersed in that sort of cultural norms and practice and habits of the Brits, as we would call them. Now, the fact of the matter is that had it not been for the slave rebellion, for the US Civil War, many whites would not also have been liberated. So when we talk about Black History Month, we cannot also extract that sort of culture, I should say, that's Black culture, as Americans would call it, from white culture, because it's an American culture. Without the US Civil War, a lot of white people, including in the North, who were getting meager salaries and wages, right? It was during the Civil War that many Northerners, also white people in the North, started to clamor for higher wages because they too were exploited. Even though you had industries in the North, we tend to look at the history from a very simplistic understanding of what took place and say, oh, there was freedom in the North and there was slavery in the South. And that's how we think. But history is much more complex than we are taught in schools. And that's why we have to dig deeper into our analysis of the same, of history, or of any matter per se, right? So the fact of the matter is that during that Civil War and after the Civil War, and Blacks clamoring for education, because we tend to think now that education is for whites, but that is not true. Had it not been for the US Civil War, as I'm suggesting here, many white Southerners would not consider themselves and would not have thought it that they too could educate themselves, right? They were not very ambitious. All their ambitions lie in having a plot of land and a Negro. That is what they said. And to them, that was what ambition entailed. So you have to give props, those of you who consider yourselves to be white in the South, even though, as I've suggested here, and this was by a British geneticist, right, that 90% of white Southerners have Black DNA. So this white-Black concept and divide is utter nonsense. And it's time for Americans to grow up because it's childish to think about race and all of and ethnicity. And most Americans cannot distinguish between what they consider to be race and nationality and ethnicity. Don't have a clue, right? I taught at Howard for some time and I taught Spanish, right? So there are times when I would ask, when I'm doing Spanish 1 and we would have our exams and I would say, ¿Cuál es tu nacionalidad? Right? And ¿Cuál es tu nacionalidad? Means, what is your nationality? And I would ask the students at Howard University. Some of them, a few of them were also whites and other ethnic backgrounds. But for the most part, the university was predominantly African American because that's what it is, an African American university. And I would say 95% of my students would respond, soy Afroamericano or soy Afroamericana. They would say to me that I'm African American. And I would have to say to them that you are an American, soy Americano or soy Americana, right? Because that is who they are. They are Americans. If you are going to talk about your ethnic group, then you can say that I am of African descent, or I am of Haitian descent, or I am of Jamaican descent. Your nationality is you are an American, and there needs not to be any title behind it, right? Any descriptor by saying that you are Italian or you are Jewish or you're an American. And if Americans can understand that and begin to apply those principles to their everyday life, I think you will see a lot of racial. It's not going to go away, by any stretch of the imagination. Racial disharmony or divide or division, whatever you want to call it, or tensions will not go away by doing that. But I think you will diminish a huge portion of it because just by calling yourself whatever it is, right? In the Caribbean, where people might say that they don't have lots of white people, well, depending on the island or whatever. But you have elements of all different nationalities and ethnicities on these islands. And people call themselves by their nationality. They are Dominican, they are Jamaican, they are Trinidadian, they are Antiguan, they are Barbadian. They're not going to say that they're Afro-Dominican and they are Asian Dominican as Americans do. And I think for the most part that they live a little bit harmoniously in the Caribbean as people live in the United States. And a lot of time, US citizens bring that sort of remnants of the nonsense in America and the practice of the habit of doing that to the Caribbean and to other parts of the world. And they find that their understanding of people is limited by putting them into boxes, right? And sometimes I just sit and watch Americans as they do the same. They are not able to separate ethnic groups from racial groups from national groups. So everybody, oh, you see a person who looks black and he should behave like a black American and should behave the way how a black person in America behave, or you see somebody who looks, typically white, and then that person should behave in that way. But it doesn't work like that, right? It does not work like that. We know that all our successes, be they economic, social, or political, and otherwise, education, and otherwise, depend on the conditions, the socioeconomic conditions that we have been brought up in. So as we suggested here, the slaves, the white people, not the slaves, but the white people, the majority of white citizens in the South before the Civil War were poor. They were dirt poor. Was it because white people were innately poor and they should be poor? That's white Southerners? No, it was because of the socioeconomic conditions, right, around which they had to live or in which they had to live. And that's why they were poor. And the same thing, white Americans, not because you go to a Caribbean country, wherever you go, and wow, you see poverty like in Haiti, perhaps in Jamaica and other countries, you're going to think that that describes the people because that's how they are and they can't really, because it is the socioeconomic conditions that shape why people are in that situation. And if you should look and dig deeper, you would look at the IMF policies and this neoliberal, policies, right? This economic model that many of these countries have to follow. That is why they are poor, right? And many times you're benefiting. Those in Americans, people in America are benefiting from the impoverishment of these people, right? Just like the white elites in the South benefited significantly from the impoverishment of US white people in the South before the US Civil War. And it was Black people and their ambition after the Civil War to educate themselves. That's why many white people also wanted to educate themselves. The problem is Black people were moving too fast, right? And they were acquiring positions that whites thought that they should not be in. And hence you had to have another segregation. That's why it came the Jim Crow laws, because Black people were moving too fast. They were going to Congress, being congressmen and congresswomen, and achieving with great rapidity, right? Lots of different career uh, opportunities. Do you know that after the Civil War and when whites, particularly those in the South, saw how fast Blacks were moving, that they came up with these very draconian laws that they could not even, first of all, they could not be found loitering on the streets. And they could, but at the same time, when they were looking for a job, if you were looking for a job, you have to walk, right? And look at that. At the time in which they lived, you didn't have the abundance of cars that you're seeing now on the roads. So people had to walk, right? For the most part, those who didn't have means of taking a lorry or whatever, they took that, riding a horse or, you know. But the fact of the matter is, they were so ambitious, and when they were seeking a job, laws would still lock them up because they, even though they had their particular, they were dressed, as they sought to be employed, the police would still send them to prison because they would still be accused of just loitering on the streets, even though they weren't loitering. So the white population in the South sort of immobilized them and didn't want them to achieve anything, because after the Civil War, as I told you, many Black people went to school and they wanted to learn how to read. They were very ambitious. So even though they were on the plantations, they were observing how these slave masters and their children behaved. And they realized that they had opportunities. And when they got that opportunity, they used the opportunity so that they could uplift and elevate themselves. And we have a lot of Black people now, particularly in the United States, but not only in the United States, in other countries, who think that education is something that they should laugh at. And it's for the white man. But I'm here to say to you that the white man, or the white woman, I would say, in the South particularly, Black people were the ones who set the tone and the example for them to educate themselves. And to let them know that just having a Negro, as they wanted to have had, and a plot of land was not going to bring them the sort of prestige that they would have loved to have had. So fast forward to what is happening at Harvard and other institutions, and behaving as if Black people are inferior in terms of positions that they hold. And they'll come up with every little nonsense, some of them hatched. And some of them also, a lot of the white people are also guilty of. And I'm not here to defend the interest of Claudine Gay and among other Black people who might have messed up. Some of them might have messed up, but a lot of white people also have messed up and are guilty, more so guilty in some cases, of some of the charges that are leveled against so-called Black people. I just wanted to say that because sometimes we do not have an understanding of who we are as a people. But as I say too, as a people, we ought to be very careful, Black people, those who deem yourself and call yourself Black people. You've got to be careful of seeing another person who looks like you and think that they have your best interests at heart, because many of them don't. And you have to understand there are many Black elites who have joined, who are in cohort. They have united with so-called white people and among other people to inflict serious dangers and harms upon you. It's not because somebody sounds like you and looks like you. It means that that person has your best interest at heart. And we've got to be careful of that. We're too emotional when it comes on to people who look like us, and we let our guards down. And we've got to understand that human behavior is very complex. It is not just the color of the skin that matters. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, it is the content of the character. And I dare to expand on Dr. King's statement, his expression of the content of character, and say that it's your heart. It's your heart. It's what is in the heart that matters. It's not what is on the exterior, because what is on the exterior is oftentimes superficial, very superficial. And that is why many of us cannot understand the cultures in which we live, because we're looking at people. And, I was talking about the whole Bob Marley's, premiere, One Love. And because Ziggy Marley is the face of the production, people think, wow, that means it's going to be good. And I'm sure it's good from a production perspective and from, whatever people do to make their movies, right? I'm sure it's excellent from that perspective. From a superficial perspective, I'm sure it is an excellent film. But we also got to look at the agenda. What is behind? Who is behind the film, the making, the production of the film, and not just look at who we are seeing. the Ziggy Marleys. And yeah, it's a son, so his son is going to protect his image. His son is going to ensure that his image, that's Bob Marley's image, that is not commodified, right? But parents have to understand, and we've got to understand that children don't always walk in the same route and pathway that their parents walked. They're individuals and they must be separated. And sometimes children even can and have and will continue to betray the interests of their parents, right? And we're also living in different times. Bob was living in a different time, and Ziggy Marley is living in a different time. And sometimes we adapt to our times and we move on. And what was Bob's interest at the time is not Ziggy's interests right now. And the person to whom Bob was married, Ziggy, his son, is married to another person of a different culture, right? And nationality too, if you will. So these are the things I just wanted to highlight, but we were talking about the commercialization. That's what we want to talk about this morning of Black History Month. And I saw an article in the UK Guardian newspaper, and I thought of sharing that article with you this morning. So let me begin by sharing my screen so that we can delve into that article. And the article here is written by Malaika Jabali, and I hope that I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Malaika Jabali, if you watch this video. Now, it was published on Tuesday, the February 23rd, 2021. So just perhaps 2.5 years ago, two plus years ago, let's say 2.5 or 2+ years ago. Now, instead of transformative changes, we get Black History Month themed Apple Watches and Black sitcom collections on Netflix, right? So that's what it's all about, the commercialization, because that is what Americans do. That is what the parasitic predatory capitalist class does at this moment. And I did tell you in previous videos that if they can really sell your pair of eyes and your tongue and your mouth and hands, we will sell them if you allow them to do so. And many of them allow them to do it. Now, let's get into the weeds of the article. Black History Month, the annual commemoration of Black history in the United States that originated with Carter G. Woodson's Negro History Week, is winding down. So it was coming to an end in that year. I have to admit, this year's celebration is among the worst yet. Granted, we were also in a pandemic, so we have to also bear that in mind. Now, instead of providing a platform to explore the rich history of Black people in America, this month has been a billboard for commodified representations of Blackness. Commercializing rather holidays and co-opting Black cultures are both standard practices in America. And I want to read it again. Commercializing holidays and co-opting Black culture are both standard practices in America. That could be the thesis of the article, because that is what it's all about. And these people, particularly those in the Democratic Party, like to use Black people as objects. They're not doing anything for Black people, but they like to think people to sympathize, all those poor Black people, we have to help them. When at the end of the day, they're not even thinking about you. They're thinking about an agenda, a broader agenda that they want to inflict. And that agenda is not an agenda that is going to uplift and elevate Black people or anybody, whether be they white or Asian or Hispanic. And you've got to understand that. And many of you sit in your living rooms thinking that these people are there to help you. Now, like the PAT, Black Lives Matter virtue signaling last June, branded cooptation of Black history has been rampant. For some, This visibility may indicate that Black people have advanced, right? And all this, yeah, the Black Lives Matter, all these are virtue signaling, right? Has nothing to do with the upliftment of Black people, right? It's just using symbols. And people like to virtue, signal. They like to think that they are more righteous than the other person, and that they believe in Black people, and they believe that they're sympathizing, right? And they are in solidarity with Black people. But sometimes you've got to look beneath the exterior and the veneer and see that these people are not real. They're not authentic. They're not genuine. And you've got to do that. Now, but what I see is an admission: powerful elected officials and corporations in the US resort to symbolism and token opportunities because they'd rather not offer anything else. If you can offer a symbol, then yeah. So the one love, one heart, let's get together and let's feel all right. These are symbols. A movie is a symbol, right? These are symbols, and people will think and will be proud because yes, Bob Marley, a Jamaican, is on the world stage. And as a result of that, people will want to go to Jamaica because of this One Love biopic movie. Not understanding that you might have an IMF program, an international monetary program that might be there, that might be stealing away and stealing your resources, and among other multinational corporations, and you're not paying attention because you're so much caught up. You're so much caught up with this emotional nonsense about one love, one heart. Let's get together and feel all right. In a system that relies on exploiting labor and directing resources to an elite minority, actually advancing the health and prosperity of the masses of Black people undermines the exploitation that capitalism relies on, right? So they are projecting these resources to an elite minority. They're the ones who are going to benefit. You are not the one who will benefit. And I've always said to you that you must be able to differentiate when you listen to the news, when they talk about Americans, if they talk about Jamaicans, or if they talk about British, if they talk about Jamaicans, whomever they talk about, you've got to differentiate between the elites and the ordinary man, because that is the society in which we find ourselves. And that is why very, very rapidly we are seeing the sudden, right, disappearance of the middle class. The middle class is going away because you're going to have just two divisions: the super rich versus the very poor. That's where our societies are moving into that direction. Just to have the very rich and the very poor. And we're helping them to accomplish that because we won't think. And if we do not begin to think, because this war is more intellectual, I did say that to one of my viewers, some times ago, that the war in which we are engaged, particularly in the West, it doesn't mean that they're going to bomb you, or they might eventually, but the fact of the matter, the war is much more mental and intellectual, and it's psychological. Because if you can't think, which many of us can't, and I was talking to somebody yesterday, and we were lamenting the whole fact that many of the world's population, including in the United States, do not have the ability to think. They cannot think critically for the life of me. And even if you have a PhD, even if you have an advanced degree, a professional degree, even among lawyers who deem themselves to be persons to use language and to think and to argue, cannot think. They might be able to perform the duties of the job because that's what they have been indoctrinated into doing. That's what they have been trained to do, but it does not mean that you're able to think. And that is why we cannot solve the problems that are afflicting our modern societies. Now, Right-wingers crystallized this point in the early months of the pandemic. We can't let the stock market tank, so we have to get people back into stores and warehouses to service us. To put a finer point on it, conservatives on both sides of the aisle assume that if these workers, who are disproportionately Black and brown, are given any sort of government aid or regular stimulus checks, they may not want to slave away in low-wage jobs. God forbid people can protect their well-being and not stuff some corporate manager's pocket, or pockets, as she suggested here. So instead of transformative policy, that's what we need in our societies. A select few Black Americans are often hyper-visibility, are given rather hyper-visibility. And that is true. That is a select few who are given hyper-visibility, right? A select few. And you think that they represent you, but they don't represent you. Barack Obama doesn't represent the ordinary African American, neither his wife or children, as a matter of fact. Right? These people don't represent you. And you gave them your votes, yes, and I'm happy that you did because it was symbolic. But that's what it's, yeah, the entire thing was symbolic, had nothing to do with uplifting Black people. Well, if you think that you got some inspiration, and power to you, more power to you, those who might have been inspired and you went to university and you upgraded yourself because you thought that Black people can also achieve. I'm happy that that happened, but based on what we're seeing now, the majority didn't. The majority weren't inspired because we're still in a very precarious situation, and some of us are in a worse situation after this Barack Obama's regime, after his administration. Many Black people find the situations to be even worse than before he entered the political realm as president of the United States. Instead of living wages, universal health care, student debt cancellation, free public college, or anything that can minimize massive Black-white wealth gap, we get Black History Month themed Apple Watches and Black sitcom collections on Netflix, because that is what it's all about. And very soon we'll see the premiering of Bob Marley's movie on Netflix, because it's making money. That's what it does, right? And people don't see that because they're proud to be Jamaicans. Who cares? Right? Now, instead of reparations to address the centuries of harm that contributed to Black Americans facing some of the highest COVID-related fatalities, we get kente cloth prayers and Snapchat slave chain filters. Instead of commitments to defund police departments or good faith debates around abolition and perhaps the largest protest movement in history, we get the author of Crime Bill for President, who made some unbinding commitments to include a few Black people in his administration, because he is the author of the Crime Bill of 1994-1995, the same Joseph Biden that is in office. That was a person who is going to and was going to at the time save democracy. The one who authored the bill to have many Black Americans, particularly Black males, in prison. This is what we need to understand. What we don't get, however, is progress, right? There's no progress. That's what they just symbolisms, because that is what makes Black people emotional. To see the first time a Black president in the history of their lives, to see a vice president, right? And you say, wow, that person's Black. And you think that makes you somebody. And I always say to you, well, I shouldn't say always, I said to you yesterday when we talk about celebrities and worship, that you need to understand that these people do not define you. And why do you want people whom you do not know to define you? Why are you inviting them into your lives? Right? And they have such disproportionate levels of control over you and your children. Right? Why not give that status of hero to people who you really know and who are making positive impact on your life and the lives of your children, right? Why are you giving it to these people? Because the mass media, you know, project them as saviors, and you believe that, right? After decades of political realignment that saw Democrats focus policy on business interests and pivot marketing to Black Americans, the Black incarceration rate has grown, right? Because that's what the Democrats have done, by the way. They have used Black people and continue to use them to project themselves as the party of inclusion and the party of diversity and the party that is not racist. But when you look at it beyond what you're seeing, when you unveil the agenda, you see that they are perhaps more racist than the Republicans. If you open up your eyes and think, and not that the Republican is a good party also, but that it is telling you this is what we are doing and this is what who we are. While the Democrats are cloaked into this coat of inclusion and diversity and equity, that you don't see that what they're doing is making you more, you know, unequal. Black employment has grown, the Black-white wealth gap has grown, and the Black home ownership rate has been virtually unchanged since the 1970s. So there's no improvement among Black people. The percentage of Black men without a job in deindustrialized towns has been obscene, reaching up to 53% for Black men in their prime working years in a city like Napoli, while Black women and Latinas experienced the largest job losses of any other demographic rather by 2020's end. So we're seeing here that this agenda that the Democrats have of using Black people, commercializing the bodies of Black people, is tantamount to slavery. And we've got to understand that this is not about wanting to help you, wanting to see you progress. This is about using a month in which they are going to commercialize you and to make lots of money, right? And you've got to understand that. I think I want to read this before I end. We have in 2021, with the financial security of many Black people bottoming out, historical firsts are not enough, and parading Black people on screen is not progress, right? And I'm happy that this article was written and was published in the Guardian newspaper, who is really, the Guardian newspaper really, I should say, which is an extension of the US military complex, the US military industrial complex, because the Guardian newspaper really is not the paper that it used to be. But we can say that it has published an interesting piece right here, right? And the fact of the matter is that Black people need to wake up and need to stop thinking that because somebody's on your street and they're showing that person as an inspirational person, you know, and as I'm saying, Bob might have inspired many people around the world, right? But Bob cannot really solve the injustices by himself. Well, he couldn't when he was alive. Barack Obama also could not have changed the US structurally, racially, and in other facets. He couldn't. And we are living an illusion, and our minds are deluded when we think that he could or that he can. He can talk all he wants to talk, and he can use and make lofty speeches. He can use, you know, great words, eloquent words, and make lofty speeches. But at the end of the day, he will not be able to transform America. Because what we need now are transformative policies. I do believe, however, and I do not want to sound pessimistic, that at this juncture of the history, of world history, of American history, that the problems that we're facing cannot be solved. I don't think they can be solved. And even if they could be solved, I think that people are living in such a grand illusion that they cannot be solved. Because if we want to solve problems, we have to come to an awareness of the truth, even though the truth hurts. So if you go to the doctor and you have cancer, and the doctor, because he wants to be nice to you and he doesn't want to hurt your feelings, then he says you don't have cancer. What's going to happen to you? Right? The cancer is going to eventually spread, and then you are going to eventually die. Right? And we have the Democratic Party. They don't like to tell minorities the truth about what they think about them. So what do? They say that you are wonderful people and that they're trying to include you in everything that they do. And sometimes they will include the worst people to represent minorities. Because obviously they don't want people who are visionary, as the writer is here. They would not want her to be a vice president because she would tell it as it is. And people don't want it to be told as it really is. You talk too much. You're too revolutionary. Right? That is what they would say. You chat too much. You are a problem maker because you're telling the truth. Truth is an enemy in our society today. And that is why we are not going to be able to solve any of the intractable problems that beset or bedevil our society. As Black History Month continues, as the days go by, we've got to spend time reading and reflecting about the state, about the plight of Black people in the world. And by when I say Black people here, I'm meaning people of African descent. Stop listening to these elite Black people as they speak and believe that they represent you, because they do not represent you, particularly if they are in politics. Right? People like to say religion is the opium of the people or the opiate of the people. Right? They like to say that because it sounds good. That's what Karl Marx said. And by the way, Karl Marx, moved from being religious to being, practically somebody who worshiped the devil. The entire philosophy is based on the worship of the devil, because that communistic agenda is nonsense, right? And we know that that is not feasible, because how are you going to impose that sort of the ruling of the proletarians? By killing people. You have to get rid of a large number of people. How are you going to be able to foster and to tap into and to develop talents if everybody's going to be earning the same wage and we're all living equally in society? It's nonsense. It's nonsense. And this diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda is that agenda clothed in different clothes, right? And we've got to understand that, right? And stop thinking that because somebody looks like you, that person means you well. Because oftentimes they don't. And that is not only for Black people, that's for all humanity, for all people who might look alike or come from the same nation or kindred or tongue, right? Doesn't mean, therefore, that you share the same values. And we have to grow up. And I don't think that we are growing up as a people. And one of the reasons why we have not grown up is because we loathe to read and to reflect and to think. We think about frivolous matters, about petty issues, about people and who they're shacking up with. We tend to be so curious about, what people are doing in their homes and their private lives than what our leaders are doing behind the scenes and how these policies are going to affect us. We don't have to think about these things because if we think about these things, they make us depressed. But yeah, they are in fact depressing. I'm not going to lie to you. But if you don't understand them, then you will not be able to fight against the attacks and to fight against the deceptions. And when you are deceived, deception can be a very, dangerous tool. It can even kill you, right? And we saw what happened during the health emergency and how many people were deceived, right? So many people were deceived because they failed to have done the thinking for themselves. They waited for people whom they thought were people of integrity to inform them. And informed they were, but they were not truthfully informed. As a result of that, we saw the deaths and the injury of many people. We've got to wake up and we've got to realize that this world is not a black and white world or Hispanic world. This world is made up of people who are decent, law-abiding, noble, or people who are just wicked, evil, right? And who are murderers. You've got to understand that. It's not because somebody is cultured or appears to be cultured, is wearing a jacket and a tie and a nice suit. Doesn't mean therefore a person cannot kill and is not a murderer at heart. Some of us think that the murderers are just the people who are looking, they're, shabbily dressed and they're unkempt. We think these are the true murderers, the ones who can't use English or Spanish or French, standard Spanish, standard French, and standard English. We think, oh, these are the lumpen proletariat. And they are the ones who are more able to kill us. But remember now that this can come from the higher echelons of society. And they are generally the authors of these murderous policies and murderous plans. If you read history, that's what you'll see. Right? Stop giving loyalty, full loyalty to politicians and your whatever leaders that matter. You shouldn't even give your full loyalty to a pastor because the Bible enjoins upon us that we should not trust any man. Don't put your trust in man. I mean, of course, you have to trust. Trust is important in any society, but you cannot blindly trust people. You have a mind to think. So when they speak, you must listen to their words carefully. And sometimes, even if you do not get what they say, that's what I do. Sometimes when people talk, I might not get what they say on the moment because sometimes you are thinking, you are doing something, and you might be tired, you might be sleepy, whatever, right? But if I didn't get it, I will wake up or I will go home and I will say, but that person said X, Y, Z. Why did he or she say that to me? And what are the consequences? What was that person trying to imply? What was that person trying to infer? And I reflect on every day what people say, how they say they say it, and what were their possible intentions. You've got to do that. harass the mind sometimes, but if you are going to be able to think clearly and to understand the world in which we live, you've got to do it. Because we are surrounded by evil and evil people in our current world in which we live, whether we like it or not. That is reality. Thank you so much for joining, and I look forward to chatting with you another time. I hope that I can see you soon. Bye. Have a great day.